good evening or afternoon, depending on where you are.
Team.
Oh, I'm
Good
sorry.
evening or afternoon.
Wherever you are in our great country. My name is Rakeem Brooks. I am president of the Alliance for Justice, and I just want to thank you for joining our latest edition of Holding Court. It's our event series that we hold quite regularly to discuss important, pressing issues with our nation's leading advocates, attorneys, and elected officials to discuss issues that are related not only to our courts, but to our constitutional rights and to our justice system. Tonight, we are honored to be joined by several incredible individuals, starting with Senator Tina Smith, who is a senator from Minnesota. In addition to her extensive career in public service, Senator Smith has served as a vice president at a Planned Parenthood of Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota. Not only has she dedicated her career to ensuring reproductive freedom, for which we are all so grateful, Senator Smith has also used her time in the Senate to fight tirelessly for judges that will protect the rights of every individual in the United States, not just the wealthy and the powerful. In fact, along with Senator Klobuchar, she has recommended Kate Mendez to President Biden, who is an outstanding nominee to the U.S. District Court for the District of Minnesota. She's a 20-year public defender, and Ms. Menendez would bring important demographic and professional diversity to our judiciary, which is so important to the Alliance for Justice. And finally, Senator Smith has become a true champion of court reform, including expanding the number of justices on the court, which tonight's discussion will show is absolutely necessary to protecting our democracy. Next is Farah Diaztello, who is the legal director of If, When, How, and a leading scholar on reproductive justice. She has worked to ensure that people can end their own pregnancies with dignity and without fear of arrest. She has written extensively on issues regarding the criminalization of pregnancy and the economic coercion of childbirth. We then have Blake Rocap, who is the legal director of Jane's Due Process, an organization that supports volunteer lawyers across Texas to ensure that if a young person makes the decision to get an abortion, there is an attorney in their community ready and able to help them. We'll keep going with more and more guests. We have Oriaku Njoku, who is the co-founder and executive director of the Atlanta-based Access Reproductive Care Southeast, which supports Southerners in navigating pathways to accessing safe, affordable, and compassionate abortion care. Finally, our moderator this evening will be Imani Gandy, senior editor of Law and Policy at Rewire News Group and co-host of Boom, Lawyer Podcast. Now, let me just say a few words about why we're gathered tonight. Our discussion this evening could not be more timely. Since September 1st, when SB 8 went into effect in Texas, the people of Texas have been effectively denied an essential constitutional right, which is the right to have an abortion. Despite a law that on its face violates the Constitution and egregiously sets up a bounty system to chill the rights of pregnant people, and in spite of a powerful opinion by an Obama-appointed trial court judge, Republican-appointed judges on the Fifth Circuit and the Supreme Court let this egregious law go into effect. While we await the court's decision on whether Texas could even be sued to stop the unconstitutional law, which will come on December 1st, on December 1st, the Supreme Court will hear Dobbs v. Jackson, Women's Health Organization, which will be a challenge to Mississippi's also unconstitutional 15-week abortion ban. This is the court's third major abortion case since 2016, showing that the right is constantly attempting to attack the central holding of Roe v. Wade, which is that every person has a right to decide whether to continue their pregnancy prior to viability. Sadly, the stakes of this case stretches far beyond abortion rights. Never before in the court's history has the court struck down a well-established constitutional right, and should they do so with abortion rights, there's no telling what else we can expect in areas of marriage equality, criminal defense, or other constitutional rights and protections that are unpopular with conservatives, but nevertheless are essential to our liberty as Americans. Today, we'll hear about the legal landscape and what those assaults mean for real people throughout the country, and most importantly, what we can do to fight back. Fortunately, we have amazing legislators like Senator Tina Smith who are in the trenches trying to pass crucial legislation like the Women's Health Protection Act, which would codify Roe v. Wade in legislation and law. We also have amazing lawyers and activists on the front lines fighting to make sure that people can exercise their constitutional rights, and that will be the subject of tonight's discussion. So we'll have a conversation for about 45 minutes and then open it up for questions for the audience. You can submit questions throughout the program by emailing rachel@afj.org, spelled the traditional way, RACHEL @afj.org. Live captioning is also available for this program. You can turn on the captions using the closed caption button on the bottom of the screen in your webinar controls. And so with that, thank you to everyone for joining. Thank you for our panelists for participating in this tonight. And I'll turn it over to Imani.
Imani's muted.
Yeah, Imani's muted.
You know, you would think after doing so many of these, I'd be able to figure the mute part out, but alas, no. Sorry about that. Senator Smith, I wanted to thank you so much for joining us, and I'm sure you're very busy. My first question goes to you. So you've served as Executive Vice President of External Affairs for Planned Parenthood in Minnesota, and you're now Senator for the state of Minnesota. So as someone who's worn both hats, what has been your reaction to this recent wave of abortion bans in the South, particularly like the Mississippi 15-week ban and the 6-week ban, SB 8 in Texas? Like, have you seen bills, specifically with respect to SB 8, have you seen a bill designed with those sort of mechanisms before?
Yeah, well, thank you for that, Imani. And it's such wonderful, it's great to be with all of you. After a long day in the Senate, it's great to be with all of you tonight. So I want to answer that question in two ways. Because first, I think from my experience at Planned Parenthood, I understand that for people that are seeking to exercise their personal autonomy and their freedom to end a pregnancy that they don't want, abortion is not a political issue. It is a personal freedom and autonomy issue. It is an economic issue. It is highly personal, but not political. And so I have been thinking about the women in Texas and the women in states all over this country who are faced with the reality that they're unable to exercise that right at a time when they weren't even aware, they weren't even aware that they were pregnant. And then suddenly they realize that they don't have that option. And the incredible burden that places on people, particularly people who don't have the resources to go to another state or to drive long distances. So it's a personal thing. And that's the first piece of it. But, second of all, I'm really struck by how we have been watching for decades states whittle away at women's and men's constitutional rights. And now we sort of see the full flowering of that in this Texas case, and a Supreme Court that is defiant of the constitutional freedoms that have been protected up until now. And so it's not a sense, I don't approach this from a sense of surprise, but a sense of this is a tragic inevitability of the right-wing capture of our courts. And what can we do? We have to be able to take action to address that problem as well.
I want to follow up on something you said. You're talking about the right-wing capture of the courts. Something like 1 out of every 4 appellate court judges is a Trump appointee. Obviously, he has the 3 Supreme Court justices. With these court cases regarding these laws front and center, including the Supreme Court oral argument in the Dobbs case coming up on December 1st, it's obvious that Trump has had an impact on the conservative backing of the courts. Sorry, my dog is also very upset about the conservative backing of the courts. And so, unfortunately, given Trump's influence on the courts, now he promised to appoint these judges that would automatically overrule Roe versus Wade. I mean, that was sort of a litmus test for him. Right. And now, unfortunately, they're in a position, they're poised to do that thing, to overturn Roe versus Wade. So, you've recently been a champion of Supreme Court reform, and that's obviously, expanding the number of justices on the court is one aspect of that, and one of the aspects that, the Alliance for Justice has supported. So can you explain why it is that it's so important that the justices be expanded, that other forms of court reform be enacted?
Well, I think that we have to understand that this far right-wing court that is out of touch with the values of most Americans, as all of the polling shows, is the I mean, this conservative tipping of the court has been 40, 50 years in the making. It has been a concerted strategy. It didn't just happen. It's been a concerted strategy. And the question that we all have to ask ourselves, who want to be champions of a democracy that actually is responsive to the people, is what are we going to do about that? And it just has become increasingly untenable, I think, for us to say, oh, there's nothing we can do about it, or we're so worried about what they're going to do in response to our correcting this capture that we don't take action ourselves. I think what I have come to appreciate is that we actually have a responsibility to restore balance to the Supreme Court, remembering that the reason the Supreme Court looks the way it does is because Mitch McConnell, as majority leader, when he was majority leader, literally changed Senate rules twice in order to add 2 Supreme Court justices, which has given us this 6-3 anti-choice majority that we now are faced with. So for me, this is not a radical idea. This is a question of, are we going to take the action that we need to take to restore a balance and impartiality to the court that has been lost by the actions of this right-wing extremist machine that has been operating for 40 or 50 years now. Imani, I think you're still muted.
Imani, you.
For the love of God. Okay.
we appreciate that your dog wants to get in on the action here, right?
He really does. He does. But one thing that I found sort of comforting, sort of a port in this abortion storm, is the fact that so many people have been activated around the issue of reproductive rights and reproductive justice. You know, we've seen rallies around the country. We've seen rallies in Texas. We've seen rallies on the steps of the Supreme Court. You know, people are galvanized. They're fired up. And so, you know, as a senator, can you tell us if there are legislative remedies that Congress can enact in order to carry out the people's will and to protect, you know, pregnant Americans' access to abortion and reproductive health care?
Yeah. Well, first, I want to completely agree with you that I do think that this is a galvanizing moment. And many of us who've been active in women's healthcare, in healthcare broadly, and in you know, the fight for reproductive freedom, have been worried about this for a long time. But I think honestly, people have said, oh, it's never going to happen. We don't need to worry about this. And the actions of the court with the Texas case. And again, as you have been pointing out, we need to shift to be thinking about what they're going to do with the Dobbs v. Jackson case, which was really explicitly designed to overturn Roe versus Wade. I think people are realizing that this is not just an idle threat. This is happening in real time. So I do believe that it is really galvanizing. The reality is that we don't actually have a pro-choice majority in the United States Senate. It is, however, extremely important that we keep pushing for legislation like the Women's Health Protection Act. We need to codify the rights and the rights and freedoms that are emboldened and embodied in the Roe decision. We need to put that into law. And we also need to, I think, look at what is happening in state legislatures all over this country, where the actual footwork of destroying women's reproductive freedom, people's reproductive freedom, has been happening at the state level, and appreciate the work that we have to do there to organize. Now, I come at this from as an old organizer. I believe in the power of organizing and the power of people exercising their voices. And sometimes you don't always see exactly what the path is going to look like, but I believe in that path, and I believe that that's what it's going to take.
It's great to hear you say that, and I wanted to throw this question to Oriaku, you know, because particularly when it comes to activating people, I know there are a lot of Black activists in the South. I know there are a lot of Black activists who feel like that they had ideas, that they knew certain things were coming and that they weren't listened to. So in terms of galvanization, what are you seeing on the ground?
Yeah, I feel like folks on the ground are angry, but also hopeful at the same time. Thinking about the way movement is moving in this current time, one of the things, especially when talking to folks who are outside of movement, is a conversation around okay, so we know all of the things that we're fighting against. We know all of the things that we are scared of that create fear and perpetuate stigma around abortion. But what are we actually fighting for? We're fighting for a future where we can live and thrive in sustainable communities. We're fighting for a future where our human rights are actually honored and respected. And knowing that that is what is moving us, that is what is charging us to do this work. To me is really inspiring, but also, it makes me think about like the fact that this is almost nearly 50 years after Roe v. Wade was made abortion legal. And the thing that we always hear in community is, yes, Roe v. Wade made abortion legal, but it did not make it accessible. So the idea of legalizing or, making sure that it's in the rule books, what we know historically is that the systems that have been created were never intended for people like me to thrive. And so what that looks like is we can't fully depend on the courts. We can't fully depend on politicians who don't have our best interests at heart. Like, it's up to us to make those changes. Because I've been doing this work for about 7 years. This is my 3rd Supreme Court case. And it's obnoxious. Like, there's got to be something else outside of courts that really support or, galvanize this particular movement.
I wanted to ask you, Farah, if you could talk a little bit about the immediate effect that these bills had on access, and specifically, like, who was most affected by SB 8, by laws like SB 8, by laws like the 15-week ban in Mississippi?
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to start out by saying I just got like chills hearing Oriaku saying there has to be something beyond courts, and here I am with like my loudmouth lawyer t-shirt on, like bearing that very proudly. But I think that like all of the advocacy has to be in service of the folks who are most directly affected by what is going on. And, it's not a secret. It is not a surprise. It is not unpredictable. The people who are most affected when these types of bans come down are the folks who our society has intentionally chosen to marginalize, right? So that's Black and Indigenous and other folks of color. That is, people who are undocumented, especially in Texas, where people have to cross through checkpoints to get from place to place, right? That's young folks who are unable to access, even in the most, accessible states, they still have problems accessing. So just simply people being unable to get the care that they need. But the piece that we really have our eye on as if when how is the sort of the legal confusion and fear that these bans create around self-management of abortion. So, just to give a little context to folks who are just tuning in, self-managed abortion, when we talk about that, we mean any means that a person might use to end a pregnancy that are self-sourced, so outside of the formal medical system. So that could be using the very same pharmaceutical pills that a person would get from a clinic, but they receive them through some online source or a pharmacy or something, or it could be other means, some of which are less safe and less effective. And of course, the pill is quite safe and quite effective. And, immediately, so we run a helpline called the Repro Legal Helpline, where people can reach out through secure means and get their questions answered and find out about potential risks that they might face and legal information about their rights around self-managed abortion. And, never fails. The second something like this, either is passed or goes into effect, we get waves of questions from people wanting to know, not just can I get in trouble for self-managing an abortion and for tending to my own healthcare, but, is abortion even legal? Can I have an appointment tomorrow? Am I going to get arrested if I go? And this sort of fear is, it's intended, I think, to terrorize people and, and is destabilizing in that way. So I think that's something that we want to keep an eye on, is something that's like not within sort of when we think of the list, the parade of horribles, right, of all the things that happen that go wrong, all the health consequences that we see when people are unable to access abortion care that they need. There are also these legal consequences too, and that especially in a state like Texas with a very harsh prosecutorial landscape. Regardless of whether or not the law actually says that it is a crime for a person to end their own pregnancy, we frequently see that happening. And it's something that's played out in states across the nation.
So you talk about fear and the ways in which these laws are destabilizing, and that could really I mean, that affects all marginalized people, but specifically it can affect youths. And so Blake, I wanted to follow up with you. Jane's Due Process, which is the organization that you're the legal director of, I believe, specifically helps young people access abortion care in Texas, right? And so young people already face these intense barriers in the state. So can you walk us through what access was like before SB 8 went into effect, and then how SB 8 has affected young people's access to abortion in Texas right now?
Sure. So in Texas, you have to have your parents' consent to have an abortion if you're not 18, or you can have a judge rule that you're mature and well-informed enough to make your own decision. But that process has been intentionally made more difficult in the past decade in Texas. And now judges can stretch how long it takes them to give a ruling over a weekend, because they're allowed 5 business days, which means there's no day I can file a case on behalf of a young person in Texas and get it necessarily ruled on in the same week. I could file Monday, but then my 5th business day would be the following Monday, right? Now, certainly not all judges are taking their sweet time. Some are scheduling the hearings and making rulings on an appropriate basis, but if you wanted to do that, you could wait your 5 days and then also deny the case, and then the appellate court's clock would start only when an appeal was filed. Then their 5 days would start. So there were already a ton of, and those are just the legal barriers, right? Young people also don't have the most reliable transportation always. They don't have access to a ton of cash that it takes to get an abortion in Texas, because we don't have publicly funded healthcare. We don't, and private insurance is not allowed to cover abortion either. They also don't often have great built out support systems or another adult in their life besides their parents. And I should say that most young people in Texas choose to involve their parent in their abortion decision. But the young people that we serve are, like Farah said, members of the communities that have been the most marginalized by society. They're victims of sexual assault. They are in family situations where they physically cannot get the consent from their parent. Some of them are de facto orphans and have been living with an aunt, a grandmother, or another family member, but that family member doesn't have the authority to consent to their abortion care. So they were already facing multiple barriers that took a long time for them to get the care they needed. And what Senate Bill 8 did was reduce the amount of time that they had to get abortion care to make it almost an impossibility unless everything went exactly perfect. So.
Senator Smith, can you talk a little bit about how your perception of what the response to SB 8 has been like, the response from advocates and activists and providers, and how that may be informing your response to SB 8?
Well, I think that, it's sort of, I'm sort of getting the response on a variety of different levels, I think. The first is just sort of this, how stunning it is that the Supreme Court would refuse to uphold the constitutional law and precedent with what I can only describe as sort of this trumped up procedural, explanation. I think is really striking to people. And though, as I said at the outset of this conversation, I don't think it should be surprising that this is the direction the court is going. It is sort of shocking to see it. I think also people are responding really strongly to this sort of vigilante aspect of the law, which gets at this sort of chilling idea that your neighbors are going to be turning on you. And I think it also has deep roots in the, some of the just deep systemic inequities that we have in our society broadly. It resonates with that in a way that is really terrifying to people and really just wrong. I have to say that I worry a little bit that we, not us on this webinar because we can see this, but I worry that people are so focused on what is so awful about the Texas case that they will forget to focus on what's happening in the Mississippi case, which is really the case that is primed to overturn Roe and Casey. And a lot of people were paying close attention to the dialogue amongst the justices around the Texas case recently and how they, kind of where that was going. But we should not feel like relieved if they end up addressing, I think, their misstep on the Texas case, because we have to really worry about what's going to happen with the Mississippi case.
Yeah, one of the things that I, as a Black woman, that I find interesting, that the ways in which Black people of color interact with the law and the sort of bounty hunter mechanism of the law.
I know.
There's something there that's really icky, particularly from the perspective of a person of color. Oriaku, can you talk about that a little bit and what you're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that keeps coming up is this is like an extension of the continued criminalization of Black and brown bodies. This is an extension of that. This is an extension of like the reproductive oppression that we see and that we have to encounter every single day. There's no way that you can deny the fact that the folks, we could use coded language that if we want to, but the folks who are from those marginalized community, from the low income community, are Black and brown folks living in rural areas. And so you cannot dismiss the fact that there are some deeply racist undertones in the legislation that's coming out. And I mean, it's disheartening, but it's also on brand for what happens in this country when it's talking about, these legislation being created to be in our best interests when really that's not the case. So yeah, thinking about it, as soon as I heard the bounty hunter thing, I was like, wow, this is what we're doing. Like, this is the type of surveillance that we're doing. This is the type of criminalization on our bodies that we're doing. Like, we deserve so much more than that.
Yeah, we absolutely do. And Farah, this is a question right in your wheelhouse when it comes to the criminalization of pregnant people. So can you talk about the ways in which the nefariousness of this bounty hunter mechanism and how it is that SB 8 kind of tries to circumvent the Constitution by really targeting primarily, marginalized pregnant people?
Yeah, so I think this is one of those things where the undertones aren't really understood. They're just like straight on overtones when we're talking about like these laws that are really like modeled on like fugitive slave laws, right? That are like conscripting private parties to uphold unjust laws that are depriving other people of their fundamental rights. Like this is really what it's about. And if we think it's dystopian to think of like your neighbor ratting you out, think about going to a healthcare facility, having a miscarriage, having self-managed an abortion, and having your healthcare provider be the one who turns you over. And that's like what we see time and time again in situations where people are criminalized for miscarriages, criminalized for self-managed abortions. It's very often it ends up being healthcare providers, either out of a misunderstanding of the law or belief that somebody should be punished for ending a pregnancy, turning people over to law enforcement. And I want to go back to something that was said earlier, the sort of Trump campaign promise of a Supreme Court that would automatically overturn Roe v. Wade. And the other sort of part of that statement, there is this one particular town hall debate in which he was asked, if Roe, when your Supreme Court automatically overturns Roe, should people be able to be punished for having abortions? And his answer was yes. He said the quiet part loud. His answer was yes. States should be able to impose some form of punishment. And it was one of those like double down moments, like yes, for the person who has the abortion, which it may come as news to some folks that has never really been the mainstream position, even like dating back to the common law. It was not laws that forbid abortion didn't forbid people from having them or from doing them on themselves, but rather performing them on other people. But the way that our laws have evolved and, sort of creeping attempts to treat fetuses as though they're legal persons who have a separate set of rights from the pregnant person who's carrying them, has set up this situation where if we're going to say, abortion is murder, then what does that mean for the people who have abortions? What does it mean for people who end their own pregnancies? And what, just sort of axiomatically, what we see is that they are treated as criminals. And so, even at the moment when that, when that statement was being made in Indiana, Prithvi Patel was behind bars for having ended a pregnancy using pills obtained on the internet. And it's something, that this is something that is not, it's not uncommon. We have research showing that perhaps 7% or more of people capable of pregnancy will seek out self-managed abortion. And we have research from just like a 30-day period, right, that like hundreds of thousands of people searched on Google for information about how to cause a miscarriage, how to end one's own pregnancy, right? So this is something that has been happening and it's going to continue to happen. And I think that the question that's outstanding here is, if whatever limited protection that Roe provides is taken away, are we going to have people who are already marginalized, already over surveilled and punished in our system, just thrown into a chasm of potential criminalization for just tending to their basic reproductive health care needs?
Thank you for that. Senator Smith, I know that you have to go, but I did want to give you an opportunity to, to express any feelings that you have about the way that, reproductive health care, as the only senator to have ever worked for Planned Parenthood, I feel like maybe I should give you a special opportunity to get something off your chest.
Well, I want to just say how thanks to my fellow panelists, Farah and Oriaku and Blake. Thank you so much for lifting up these issues and lifting up how this, what I'm struck by, I'll just leave it at this. Over the last couple of years, I think that this pandemic, this global pandemic that we've been living through, have really laid bare some deep systemic inequities that have been there for a long, long time. But now I think they are seen by more people. This conversation around people's ability to access their abortion rights and freedoms is really, I think, demonstrating yet again how this lack of access to healthcare, broadly speaking, lack of access to the freedoms that should all be ours, is, it links right back to the systemic inequities that we see in our country every single day. And as we're talking about how the impacts of denying abortion rights are not felt broadly, they are felt specifically by people, by Black and Brown and Indigenous people who are already struggling to exercise their rights across the board. And so that to me is galvanizing as we think about what we do about this, what I do about this as a United States Senator, but what all of us as organizers need to do to protect these fundamental rights that, though they should be fundamental to every human being who lives in our country.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Blake, I wanted to turn to you. I wanted to talk about the US v. Texas and the Holman's Health versus Jackson oral arguments. We had this massive day of oral arguments, 2 cases being heard at the same time. Can you talk about how those cases got to the court in the first place? Why did the court choose to hear these cases even after it had issued this sort of specious decision that the law may go into effect anyway, despite ongoing litigation? Can you just unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah, sure. So in July, a group of providers and funds in Texas sued several defendants in federal district court in Austin. And my James Due Process is a plaintiff in that case as well. And we're represented by the able lawyers at the Lawyering Project, and some of the other funds and clinics are represented by the Center for Reproductive Rights, and Planned Parenthood affiliates are represented by their counsel. Anywho, they sued a class of state judges and state clerks, the Texas Medical Board, I think another set of, perhaps another defendant, because the enforcement mechanism on Senate Bill A is this private cause of action where anyone can sue, and it's not a criminal process. but it allows, everyone else to sue. So their theory was that they could get an injunction against the state court judges who would be hearing these cases to enjoin them from, forcing anyone who is sued under this law to answer these lawsuits. And they were forced to do that because this is a little technical about federal civil rights law, but you have to sue a person who's in charge of enforcing a state law that violates the Constitution, and that's part of the Ex parte Young fiction that applies Section 1983 to states. So you have to sue a person. You got to find the right state official that's charged with enforcing the law that violates your rights. But in this case, there's no real correct state official, so they had to sue some other folks. The district court enjoined the law. They took it up to the Fifth Circuit. The Fifth Circuit is full of horrible both Bush and Trump appointees. If you think the 3 Supreme Court justices are bad, let's have a weekend in Louisiana on 500 Camp Street, right? It's bad, the Fifth Circuit. So they stayed the preliminary injunction, and the providers and fund plaintiffs then appealed that to the Supreme Court on an emergency basis because the law was about to take effect. It's like, August 30. And at that point, the Supreme Court said, well, they've got to stay. They've got to figure out these procedural issues on who the right person is to sue. And, they didn't block the law like they had every other similar ban that other states had passed. So there's 12 or 13 other state laws that contain the same restriction that have been enjoined. And so that the law went into effect, which the Solicitor General had a really great phrase in the argument on November 1st. She said it was an intolerable state of affairs to allow states to just be allowed to violate people's constitutional right just because the enforcement was private instead of public. So the Department of Justice sued, and there remains a question about whether the Department of Justice has the authority to sue a state in this manner, a state as a corporate being. And so that question also went up to the Supreme Court, and the court reversed itself and granted cert to the provider plaintiffs and combined those two arguments on the same day. And that's what we heard on November 1st.
That was a lot of civil procedure in there as well. No, but it was they're difficult cases, and you broke them down in, the 3-minute, you got a 3-minute summary there. So that's good. But Farah, I wanted to turn this to you, right? So just last year, we were all a Twitter, right, over June Medical Services versus Russo and what the court was going to do. And then we got this decision that at first we were happy about, but then as we dug into Chief Justice John Roberts' opinion, it was obvious that in his concurring opinion, he actually wanted just to take another peek at Planned Parenthood versus Casey. This undue burden standard, what's that really all about? So can you just talk to us about how it is we keep ending up back here? June Medical Services was a repeat of Whole Woman's Health versus Hellerstedt in 2016. And it just seems like everybody knows these pre-viability abortion bans are unconstitutional. Jess and I on our podcast, Boom Lawyered, we sing about it. That's how well known it is. But yet here we are with 2 weeks having passed. The Supreme Court has done nothing on SB 8. We're back. It's just, we're having the same arguments over and over. Help us out.
Gosh, I don't know. I wish I could, right? Like, this is the reason that we end up in the same place over and over again is that I think the Roe decision was the right decision at the time, but it definitely wasn't something that was future-proof, right? It was a compromise to begin with. I think that there's a cottage industry of sort of writing what Roe should have said and what the constitutional underpinnings of the right to make one's own decision about whether to carry a pregnancy to term or not, what they should have been based on. And, I think that I'm in the camp of if I had my druthers, this would be an equality issue, or maybe this would be a privileges and immunities issue, right? To just get really nerdy on it, that perhaps sovereignty over one's own body isn't just a matter of privacy and penumbras and all these things that are so they're just ripe to be whittled away at a little bit of a time, but something that's really about just the fundamental recognition that people don't lose their human rights upon becoming pregnant. So, I mean, I don't know. I wish I had an answer. I think that it's possible that the answer is beyond the courts. And something that I like to remind people, when they ask me about these abortion bans and like, how does it affect criminalization and all that, I think it's good to remind people that it is a relatively new artifact, that abortion is something that we ask the state for, right? That like from time immemorial, people have been getting pregnant, they've been ending pregnancies, they've been trying to prevent pregnancies. All of these things are just like fundamental to what it means to be a human being. And for the law to be involved in it is this kind of like new and weird thing. And like, that we have created this construct of like, what is a legal abortion? What is an illegal abortion? Who has the authority to provide an abortion? When in fact, it's something that people have been doing for themselves and for members of their community for as long as people have been getting pregnant. And so, when I think about what the future looks like, I think about the solidarity that we have been seeing from folks who have been doing this work for a long time under even harder circumstances in Latin America. And I think one of the most inspiring things that I saw when SB 8 went into effect was these like messages of solidarity from Mexico, from folks who were doing accompaniment work there. And, they very recently, the Mexican Supreme Court said that it was a human rights violation to criminalize abortion. So this means that like they have been under a regime of criminalization in most Mexican states for a long time. But people do it anyway. People risk the consequences for themselves, for one another, because this is just a part of human life. And so to hear the activists in Mexico from the green wave, you can see like the green bandanas everywhere saying like, we're here in solidarity. We have been where you are. We're here to help you out of it, is something that gives me great hope. And I think, maybe it can help us sort of like reset the way that we're even thinking about abortion as not as something that is like regulated in healthcare systems, but something that's just like a part of human life and perhaps like beyond the law.
I love this point about abortion being beyond courts. Oriaka, you were the first, I think, to phrase it that way. And I really like that. So can you talk about, what's at stake for the court should it do what we're all expecting it to do? What's at stake for the legitimacy of the court? And does that mean somehow then we just have to say, okay, Supreme Court, we've had enough of you. We're moving beyond the legal right to abortion and we're focusing on, as Farah has said, the human right to abortion?
I mean, truly, I am not a lawyer. So the idea of like all of the legal stuff, I'm like, I honestly don't know. Anything.
Well, no, that's why I'm kind of asking, just from a non-legal standpoint,
Yeah.
You're looking at this institution, and this institution is supposed to be the highest court of the land. It's supposed to uphold these constitutional ideals. And yet it's failed Black people from get-go, but it's failing pregnant people. So just as a non-lawyer, someone who had the sense not to go to law school, can you talk to us about how this all looks to you?
Yeah, I mean, even as soon as anytime there is any sort of abortion ban, anytime there's any sort of anti-choice legislation, I have this like deeply spiritual eye roll that happens because I'm like, what in the world? This is happening again. This is actually ridiculous. And again, it's just that like constant reminder that we can't just settle on the hope that things will change. Like we actually have to be proactive and fight for a future where reproductive justice is a reality instead of focusing on being on the defense or reacting to whatever they decide to throw out the wall and see sticks during the legislative session. Some of the immediate impacts that I see, people will talk about, oh, Roe, the future of Roe, post-Roe reality. And that post-Roe reality is actually the lived experiences of many of the people who we're in community with every single day. So many of the callers that reach out to our helpline experience that reality. And some of those immediate effects, especially on a state level, is that there's this heightened sense of fear and uncertainty that starts to like percolate on the ground. Folks start making assumptions around abortion being illegal, or in Mississippi, some patients trying to seek care out of region or out of state because they think the clinic may be too overwhelmed with patients to see them. When the reality is like, independent abortion providers like Jackson Women's Health, and all the other providers that we work with are deeply committed to making sure that, there are minimal to no interruptions in service provision for those seeking abortions. And so, as a activist or advocate, like I personally feel this like deep responsibility to increase the visibility of Black folks specifically doing this work and debunking the myths around abortion access. You know, in the case of Texas and Louisiana and Mississippi, you know, abortion funds have been in deep conversation and collaboration with not only each other, but abortion providers and other folks in the overall ecosystem, the reproductive ecosystem, to make sure that there is this continuity of care even when a pregnant person has to leave their home state to get an abortion. So all of that is happening outside the context of anyone's court, anyone's legislative session. It has been happening and it will continue to happen regardless of what the decision ends up being.
Yes, thank you for that. We're going to turn to some audience questions now. Our first question: conservative judges on the Fifth Circuit rubber stamped SB 8, but just handed down a decision blocking the Biden administration's vaccine mandate, saying, quote, maintaining the liberty of individuals to make intensely personal decisions according to their own convictions. Irony. Why do they claim this principle applies to vaccine requirements, but not to a person's right to abortion? I'm going to go to you, Farah, because you look like you're about to crawl out of your skin.
Well, I mean, I don't know. It's like because the answer is hypocrisy and control of people who can become pregnant in communities of color. Like, you know, that's, yeah. I mean, I think that there's definitely a double standard on who gets to like have a principled exercise of their rights versus who just has that stripped away from them. If somebody were to say, well, you know, and I actually, like, there are folks who are arguing this. I have a right based in my religion to be able to end a pregnancy, you know, at whatever point, if the pregnancy is, you know, it is a violation of my religious liberties to say that I have to be submitted to a waiting period, that I have to like get permission from an adult in my life, right? All of these things, you like that would be left out of the courtroom, right? So like certainly like our willingness to credit the autonomy of the individual, their fundamental rights, I think is it like that it only goes as far as that individual's identity, like frankly, that's and you know who the law is intended to control and who the law is intended to liberate, and that's I mean, and that's the problem.
Yeah, I mean, as a lawyer, Blake, I mean, do you have any explanation as to why, besides hypocrisy, why it is that they're so intensely opposed to vaccine mandates? Because my body, my choice, but then when it comes to abortion care, different story.
Yeah, we always say it's good jurisprudence except abortion, right? There's an abortion exception to all of these principles, and whether they're, you know, just our regular values or whether we pinned into some constitutional right or some procedural right, it's like, well, except an abortion, like we're gonna immediately act as the Supreme Court to, you know, stop whether it's, you know, the Fifth Circuit, the vaccine mandate, but the Supreme Court acts quickly on their shadow docket in some cases and now has had full argument, and we're still, you know, 22 days later, I guess 2 weeks, not 3 weeks. Sorry, I'm ahead of myself, but you understand. So it's, you know, people will find exceptions for things they disfavor, and it's again, and that can be manipulated and argued however. That's what lawyers do, and so judges are good at it, right? So it's they do it because they disfavor abortion, and there's no consequences for them to be that hypocritical, right? They're not going to get impeached, right? They're, you know,
yeah, no accountability there.
That's right.
Second question we have: some individuals, and particularly affluent people, will always be able to access an abortion no matter what. But for others, that's simply not the case. Can you take some time to explain the systemic factors that create this huge disparity in access and how we can work to close the access gaps in our communities? Oriako, you know I'm coming to you on this one.
Oh gosh, I just want to be like, can we say the answer is capitalism and white supremacy?
We absolutely can. We absolutely can.
No.
Nailed it. Next question.
Next. No. But honestly, like, we live in this capitalistic system where our healthcare system is privatized and profit margins determine what happens with health policy, who can receive services, what services are out there. And, you know, too many individuals continue to be uninsured Many communities lack the full range of high quality reproductive healthcare services or any healthcare services, period. And the reality is that racism, sexism, patriarchy, any other ism that you can come up with continue to be incredibly powerful forces that, work in tandem to continue to disenfranchise people of color and other groups or other marginalized groups in our society. And at the same time that's happening, there's this growth of white supremacist groups and alt-right groups being able to determine things like legislation and, how we talk about abortion in our communities. And, when thinking about some of the systemic factors, I mean, I can, like the senator was mentioning earlier about before COVID, like we knew, that these systems in place caused huge disparities in healthcare, but COVID-19 definitely exacerbated that for us. And, thinking about some of these disparities in access, I just get really, personally really upset and frustrated that this is a conversation that we're still having, that people cannot see that these disparities are actually literally killing people in my community, and something else has to happen. I'm not gonna sit and be like, ooh, let's hope the justices do what we need to do for us. That's just not where I'm coming at from this work. So the short answer, capitalism and white supremacy.
Perfect. Farah, you're nodding vigorously, so I thought I'd give you a moment to weigh in.
I mean, I feel like I could just put a little cherry on top because that was perfect. I think the thing that I want to bring in also is our friend Henry Hyde, right? And the Hyde Amendment, and the fact that when we're talking about who lacks access, it is intentional that people who rely on Medicaid for their health services in most states lack access to abortion because of this, budget rider, the Hyde Amendment that excludes abortion care. And so again, this was intentional, baked into the system. There, his famous quote, I would stop anybody from having an abortion if I could, a rich woman, a poor woman, but Medicaid is the lever that I have access to, right? And so that's intended to prevent, explicitly intended to prevent people from having access to care. And then, when that was taken up by the Supreme Court in Harris versus McRae, the Supreme Court's answer was sorry, poverty is not a problem that the state created, which I contest. It's one of those things, it's a feature, not a bug. Marginalization and poverty, it's not an accident. But it's, sort of the state abdicating responsibility for people, the people who are supposed to be under its care, right? If you're receiving your healthcare through Medicaid, it's because there's this recognition that you're unable to access healthcare another way, and this is how we do it. But we're going to withhold this important set of care from people, and so it's absolutely intentional.
Wake, you work with young people all the time, and they're trying to access abortion. Can you talk about some of the systemic factors that maybe young people face that grown folks don't?
Yeah, and I just want to add, on top of everything that the other panelists said, that abortion care is also marginalized within a system that's already marginalizes people. So we already have trouble dealing with institutions who are trying to train physicians. We already have trouble with the medical community, again, intentionally being able to refer people for abortion, or just providing abortion in a regular clinical setting, not in some special, clinic that has hallways the right distance, that sees their patients 20 with a waiting period, that does all this extra compliance bullshit, right? And that adds to people not being able to get the care they need, right? Because it's a whole different poorly run system, intentionally badly functioning system, in a badly functioning capitalist system that marginalizes people, right? So it's a layer on top of just healthcare being inaccessible. I think the one bright spot, I was on a panel earlier today with a couple of physicians here in Texas, and the bright spot is that people, that although people of means can always travel or find the doctor to provide them care, and Farah knows this better than anyone, that self-managed abortion is becoming more accessible and much safer than it ever was. And to the extent that we can help folks that need assistance in our communities to access the care that way, it's gonna be a good solution as long as we have good lawyers like Farah to defend us when we get arrested, right? So, but the young people I work with and that are my clients, they have the same barriers that I mentioned earlier, and that people that are don't have resources have. They don't have reliable transportation. They don't have control over their own schedule. They have to be in school or they're going to be arrested for being truant, right? They have, and like many adults, who don't have control over their own work schedule. They don't know when they're going to work until 3 days before. Their shifts are always changing, right? Well, that makes it impossible to schedule 2 trips to an abortion clinic that's a 4-hour drive away, right? They have the issues that all people have. They have abusive and controlling partners and parents, right? So the barriers they have are, if you know, I don't know, they seem to have all of them instead of just a few things. They like have to overcome every single different barrier, you know.
Yeah, it's like compounded. Let's turn to our third question. Abortion funds are new to me, but those organizations are doing critical work to ensure people can access the reproductive care they need. How can I find my local abortion fund and support them? Oriaku.
So in case y'all don't know what an abortion fund is, most abortion funds are part of the National Network of Abortion Funds, which is made up of over 80 grassroots organizations working to eliminate barriers to abortion access through abortion funding and providing logistical and practical support. And so when I think of, abortion funds in general, it's a group of folks who aren't necessarily focused on a brand or allegiance to any particular movement, but abortion funding is mutual aid. And as abortion funders, we're working every day to make sure that folks in our communities have what they want and need for their abortions. So if you're looking for a way to support your local abortion fund, you can definitely go to the National Network of Abortion Funds website at abortionfunds.org. And with just like a little note on what some of the work looks like now, especially with, what is going on in Texas and Mississippi and previously in Louisiana, a lot of our funds continue to collaborate with each other in a way that just like harnesses the collective power that we have in such a beautiful way, to make sure that we're either funding folks who need their abortions, providing logistical support like rides, lodging, childcare. I mean, honestly, whatever folks need to get to their appointment is where we step up. And, recently, when we do have funds available, we have also been providing, at least at ARC Southeast, which is the organization that I'm part of, providing solidarity funding for folks traveling from Texas and Louisiana and Mississippi to one of the 6 states that are in our region already, to make sure that they could still be seen in the South. There's so many stories about what happens when, for instance, we had a caller from Houston who had to travel to North Florida for their abortion, and all the logistics were covered, but they needed funding for their abortion. And while we were on the phone with her, she got another call at the same time from another abortion fund who was able to step in and provide support for her abortion. And she only ended up having to pay $60 for her procedure and was able to use the rest of the money that she had for food or meds or any other thing that may have popped up during her procedure. So yeah, get into abortion funds if you're not into it already. And there's so many ways not only to be involved as volunteers, but, make the contribution to make sure that, if you can't personally give someone a ride, you're at least paying for an abortion. So.
Muted, remember to unmute. I did want to, there was a shout out from one of our viewers. I want to thank Senator Smith for using, no, we're not going to read that. Okay, moving on. Moving on, I just wanted to say that there was someone who thanked the senator for using women-centric language. And I do want to impress upon everyone who's watching that it is not just women who need abortions. So you know, while it can be useful for solidarity purposes, I understand, to feel like women are in this fight together. How can we be in this fight together if we are excluding our trans sisters, if we're excluding non-binary people, if we're excluding other people who need abortion care? So, you know, I just have to push back on that. I think that we're doing a real disservice to the movement and to people who need help by focusing solely on women. And on that note, I do want to give Blake and Farah and Oriaku a chance to just, any closing thoughts, you know, what keeps you inspired and motivated during these fights? And what are some of the things that give you hope? Blake, I'll start with you. And if we could just keep this short, because we are running out of time.
Yeah, sorry, I was in the middle of another Zoom crisis. What gives me hope? Is that your question? Yeah. Well, I mean, I think all the solidarity between the abortion funds and people's realization that a lot of this work is happening, and that, you know, the reality that the reality that Roe doesn't really help a ton of people and hasn't helped a lot of people where we live for 15 or 20 years. People are starting to wake up to that and to realize that they need to make access to abortion part of their political, social, philanthropy calculus if it's important to them, and it's not something that Planned Parenthood is just going to take care of. Right, that we've gotten here because we've neglected it for a long time, and we've also neglected the kind of fundamentals of our democracy for a long time. We ended up here in Texas because we've been gerrymandering these legislative districts for 15 years, since Tom DeLay infused a bunch of illegal cash to do a mid-decade redistricting, and that's really how far back it goes. So these districts cannot be won in a general election, so you get the most extreme candidates who win. So people's waking up to that has given me hope. The fact that it took such a crisis for it to happen is shameful, but here we are.
Here we are. Farah, how about you? What gives you hope? What inspires you?
Yeah, I feel like I spoke it a little bit earlier by saying the international solidarity. So I will go with the kids are all right. You know,
Yeah.
I look on the TikTok, I'm now officially an old, and I see them sharing information about self-managed abortion, about Plan C pills, about, you know, just people getting politically active. And it's just a reminder, the law and its institutions are just people, and people can change. And so another future is possible.
And Oriaku, how about you?
Yeah, the thing that I get most jazzed about is abortion funds, for sure. I mean, they're amazing grassroots organizations rooted in the reproductive justice framework that work at the intersection of abortion access and all of the other issues that impact our communities every day. And truly, regardless of whatever ban comes out, whatever anti-choice legislation that ends up sweeping the country, just knowing that we will continue to work with people in our communities to get the abortions that they want or need, no matter what, is the thing that gives me hope every single day.
Wonderful. And I'm just going to echo everything that y'all said. I mean, I'm hopeful. I'm very hopeful about the fact that there are so many people that are activated. I'm pleased to see so many law students in law school studying Repro. That's not what I did when I was in law school. And so I just want to thank everyone who took the time out to come and watch this webinar. I want to thank my panelists, I think they're mine, these panelists, Farah Diaztello, Oriaku Njaku, and Blake Rocap. And yeah, thanks for joining us, and have a great night.